The next part of my series on a history of feminism for gamers looks at the suffragists and suffragettes, most notably the official suffragettes of the Women's Social and Political Union, led by Emmeline Pankhurst. Modern anti-feminists like to point to the acts of arson, public brawling, and other illegal acts committed by the WSPU to show that, from the beginning, feminism had a rotten core. These attacks absolutely did happen, but making these working-class women out to be anomalies in an era known for its violent worker strikes denies the greater historical picture. Britain's Great Unrest from 1910 to 1914 was occurring at the exact same time that Pankhurst suffragettes were blowing stuff up, and union demonstrations were being driven by a concept whose name may sound familiar to gamers: syndicalism. Assassin's Creed Syndicate actually takes place decades earlier, although the sentiments in the game are very much in line with this economic idea. Syndicalism has a lot of overlap with anarchism and communism, and it is simply the replacement of traditional capitalism by syndicate structures owned and managed by workers in a given industry. The massive trade unions in, for instance, the automotive industry are a result of the syndicalism of the early 20th century. But why is this important? It's important because it demonstrates an element of feminism that has, I believe, weakened the feminist message throughout its history. The tendency of feminists to attach women's rights to other causes so thoroughly that it becomes impossible to tell where feminism ends and, for instance, socialist leanings, an anti-war message, or an atheist sentiment begins. This is a major hurdle to casual observers understanding what feminism is and what it's not, because often things like an objection to violence will be bundled in with so-called feminist messaging, and there's absolutely no historical evidence that non-violence is an inherently feminist thing. If you see a video game critic complaining about the violence in a game on feminist grounds, without explaining why this particular violence negatively impacts women specifically, chances are it's not feminism. It's something that was grafted onto that feminist thinking due to associations with other schools of thought. The most likely source for the anti-violence feminist rhetoric is something that'll be discussed further during my look at the second wave. The suffragettes, in fact, were notorious for beating the tar out of police who broke up their rallies. You could probably make a pretty interesting video game based on the makeshift concealed weapons the suffragettes used, including barbed wire floral bouquets. In fact, there's a direct connection between these early beatdown feminists and the creation of fictional feminist icon Wonder Woman. Not only was William Moulton Marston's mistress, Olive Byrne, the niece of Margaret Sanger, who founded the organizations that became Planned Parenthood, but Marston himself was at Harvard when WSPU founder Emmeline Pankhurst was invited to speak on campus, then banned due to an uproar, which caused a bigger uproar. Sound familiar? Wonder Woman's fellow woman warriors ended up with the very same name the press gave Pankhurst's female bodyguards, the Amazons, which makes me wonder what the campus speech bands of 2015 will inspire in terms of popular art. It's already come up in a few episodes of The Good Wife. Pankhurst wasn't the only one banned from Harvard. Women in general weren't allowed to speak at Harvard at that time. Public speaking was considered unladylike conduct for women, and now common displays of public participation and civil disobedience by women were shocking and even frightening to many. Pankhurst herself came from some means in a politically active family. After she had children, she and her husband hired a nanny so that she could pursue her political activities. In contrast, many of the suffragettes were working-class women with connections to socialist worker parties. This connection between some of the more militant wings of feminism and Marxism has continued through to the present day, but it doesn't represent the whole or even the majority of the feminist movement. These groups do, however, get a lion's share of the publicity. The major division in first-wave feminism was class. Upper-class women were generally more interested in property rights alongside the vote. Working-class women were fighting for, among other things, access to prenatal and infant care. But let's not gloss over the acts of the WSPU. That wouldn't be fair. The WSPU didn't just set fires. They threw stones at people, broke windows, and defaced works of art. But the WSPU, the most infamous group connected to the suffrage movement, was only active for a few years. Militant feminist groups tend to have a fairly short shelf life. The WSPU was founded in 1903 by Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters Christabel and Sylvia. Pankhurst was dissatisfied with the lack of progress created by the peaceful legal advocacy of the much larger National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. The WSPU's motto was deeds, not words, and they advocated for a different form of suffrage than the greater movement. The WSPU excelled at class warfare and adopted a more populist message advocating for a form of suffrage on par with men. This meant that only women and families that owned property over a certain value would be able to vote. At that time, only 60% of men over the age of 21 even had the right to vote in Britain. Pankhurst considered this a more practical goal than the National Union of Women's Suffrage Society's support of suffrage for all women, regardless of class or employment status. Pankhurst's version of suffrage would benefit wealthier women like her, but not the working class women socialism claimed to speak for. The WSPU borrowed the protest tactics of Russian socialist protesters, but their policies were more in line with the wealthier middle class, not the lower income working class. If you think this sounds something like modern day radical feminism, you'd be right. The WSPU started getting arrested around 1905 and started hunger strikes to protest not being designated political prisoners. Initially, the government released women after prolonged hunger strikes because they didn't want martyrs. And the reports of the treatment of these women in prison were so powerful with the public that Emmeline Pankhurst got herself arrested on at least one occasion. Pankhurst didn't play nice and didn't ally with any particular political party. I'm hesitant to get into too many details regarding specifics during this time because the majority of sources of information are either those biased against Pankhurst because she was a pain in the ass, or Pankhurst herself or her daughters who were born and raised political activists. What is known is that the WSPU protested the ruling Liberal Party, even though many Liberal Party candidates were pro-suffrage. There was a street brawl in 1908 when Liberal Party supporters blamed the WSPU for spoiling the election and costing them seats that went to the Conservatives. In a horseshoe effect that we recognize today, the suffragettes ended up aiding more conservative voices, many of them women, who opposed suffrage based on the idea that men and women naturally inhabited different spheres of existence. The government introduced force feeding in 1909 to try to reduce the revolving door arrests. The feeding tubes used for this process caused physical damage and in some cases even pneumonia. It was a PR disaster. Things deteriorated from there. In late 1910, after Parliament ducked discussion of a bill about voting for women, the suffragettes claimed to have suffered mass sexual assaults by men after they chained themselves to a railing. They claimed that women were dragged into side streets and raped. I say claimed because, again, the rhetoric on both sides of the conflict leaned toward hyperbolic. There were no cell phone cameras or reliable birth and death records back then, so it's hard to say for certain what exactly happened. The most thorough account of this event that I could find, called Black Friday, is by Sylvia Pankhurst. It's safe to say, however, that something happened that night, and it was bad. There are photos of police officers beating women on the ground. Suffragettes were sometimes assaulted just for speaking in public. So the suffragettes took to learning jujitsu to defend themselves. Emmeline Pankhurst also began surrounding herself with a bodyguard, the women I mentioned that were nicknamed the Amazons by the press. The most public display of the bodyguard's ass-kicking skills came in 1914, when they took on the cops who interrupted a speech by Pankhurst to arrest her. After the police became entangled in those barbed wire bouquets, a brawl broke out between 50 cops and 30 suffragettes with concealed clubs in front of 4,000 spectators. By this point, the suffragettes' arsons and bombings had been intensifying for more than a year. These bombings culminated less than 2 months before the beginning of World War I, when the suffragettes detonated a bomb next to a symbol of British patriarchy, the coronation chair in Westminster Abbey. As if it were a metaphor, though, they managed only minor damage. The thing that brought this suffragette, I'm going to say it, terrorism, to a close was also the thing that may have opened the door for women's voting franchise. World War I. The mobilization of existing women's groups to help the war effort became symbols of nationalistic pride in both Britain and the U.S. Furthermore, men were going off to fight for their country who were still not able to vote upon their return. This opened up the subject of voting reform in various governments, and some women, as well as most men, got the right to vote and serve in government in Britain in 1918. The 19th Amendment in the United States passed in 1920. Full voting rights for women came to Britain in 1928. Thanks to the opposition of the Catholic Church, women didn't receive the right to vote provincially in Quebec, Canada until 1940. Federally, however, Canadian women, except Aboriginal women, were given the right to vote in 1918, an accelerated process compared to what happened in the US and Britain. The Canadian suffrage movement was notable in that there were no aggressive protests or violent actions. The radical activities in the US and Britain help or hurt the suffrage cause. It's impossible to say for sure. It's even possible that the violence was a reaction to heavy-handed police tactics. History is not as simple as the heroic suffragette portrayals or the anti-feminist smear campaigns claim. What's clearer is that the divisions within feminism between moderates and militants that continue to this day started in the first wave, and the majority has always been judged, at least in part, by the actions of a radicalized minority. What's also clear from our knowledge of the first wave is that feminism has never been an especially popular concept. It hasn't suddenly become disliked because it was ruined by the third wave. People have never liked change, especially change that scares them. After the success of the suffrage movement, some improvements to property rights and increased ability for women to keep their own wages, the divisions between the various women's groups became too great for a cohesive wave of feminism to continue. This is another pattern you're going to note keeps repeating itself. Another element driving a wedge among American feminist groups was the failure of prohibition. The repeal of prohibition splintered the areas of the women's movement linked to the temperance movement. The Great Depression also affected everything, as did World War II. World War II also provided one of the sparks, however, for second wave feminism, since it resulted in a large number of married women entering the workforce. But Rosie the Riveter's story will have to wait until the next part of this series.